This is the war with Benjamin, part 2. We're starting at Judges 20 and verse 29, where we left off last week. And to kind of give you an idea of where we're at geographically, you will notice the circle there is surrounding the tribal inheritance of Benjamin, and Gibeah is in the southern part of Benjamin. So, Benjamin is the youngest, you remember, of all the tribes. And so he's going to be given his blessing last by Jacob. And because of this incident, he's going to wind up being the youngest and the smallest of all the tribes. Because as we see here, sadly, the tribe in this incident is almost completely wiped out. Not so much because of what happened to Gibeah, but because his other brothers, the other tribes, in their anger, became very vengeful and kind of lost control, I think, and overdid what was appropriate in this circumstance. So there's lots of interesting lessons here. So in fact, I want to begin by asking this question. What can we learn from the tribe of Benjamin? Well, it's always fascinating. Again, another proof of inspiration. Genesis is written hundreds and hundreds of years prior to this. And it tells us something that happened during the time of Jacob. And there's prophecies involved in this. And notice what it says when Jacob blessed Benjamin as the youngest son last. It says, Benjamin is like a ravenous wolf. In the morning he shall devour the prey, and at night he shall divide the spoil. So throughout history, Benjamin is going to be known for being one of the most warlike of the tribes, and one of the ones that is the most successful in battle, especially when it comes to slinging stones and arrows. And they were often, put out front in battle for that purpose, and they were very well known for their skill in this. So 2 actions, devouring and dividing, and 2 outcomes. They're going to go after the prey and then get the spoil. And ironically enough, because of the way this lays itself out, the nation is going to be devouring Benjamin and dividing up the nation, and they are going to be the spoil and the prey because of their ungodliness. So a lot of commentators think that this is sort of this ironic, almost kind of double entendre of what's going on here. All right. They're known for being warlike. This amazing statement is made about them in Judges 20, 15, and 16. The men of Israel, besides Benjamin, were numbered 400,000 men that drew sword. All these were men of war. And it says, however, of the tribe of Benjamin, among all these people, there were 700 chosen men, left-handed. Everyone could sling stones at a hair's breadth and not miss. There are other passages about these fellows that seem to indicate that they were well known for being ambidextrous and being able to do things out on the battlefield with their left hand that would put them at some advantage. And so I thought it would be interesting to take a minute and read a couple of these other passages. Let's look at 1 Chronicles 8 and verse 40. 1 Chronicles 8 and verse 40. Okay, let's see here. It mentions here that they were mighty men, and they were the sons of Ulam, mighty men of valor, archers, and had many sons and sons and sons. And all these were the sons of Benjamin. So it kind of lays this out, that that's sort of their heritage. And then again, in 1 Chronicles 12:12, it says, let me see here. 12:2. Thank you. Do you have that handy?
Yeah.
Go ahead and read that.
They were bowmen and could shoot arrows and sling stones with either the right or the left hand. They were Benjamites, Saul's kinsmen.
Okay, so they could do either with the left or the right things that normally people would just be able to do with their right hand. And then in 2 Chronicles 14 and verse 8, and Asa had an army that bare bucklers and spears out of Judah, 300,000 men. And then it specifies out of Benjamin that bare shields and drew bows, 280,000. All of these were mighty men of valor. So the Benjamites, and these are just the survivors from this terrible incident we read about in Judges, they're going to go on to continue to be especially adept at being archers and are set out as an important part of Asa's army. And same thing is said of Jehoshaphat's army in 2 Chronicles 17:17. And of Benjamin, a mighty man of valor, with him 200,000 armed with bow and shield. So they talk about the people of Judah, and then their front line, kind of their green berets or something, were these Benjamites. And that's what was told of him at Jacob's deathbed. Very interesting. All right. But unfortunately, they are also known for their ungodly defense of Gibeah. And by the way, I think the fact that they were so trained in war is maybe one of the reasons why they're overconfident and why they're able to defeat the other 11 tribes the first 2 times it happens, is they were very adept at warfare. One of the things you learn from history is that oftentimes empires and nations, this was certainly true of Rome, they begin to rely on their military might and on their army. But the real enemy is the moral decadence within, and that the nation tends to implode from within because of a lack of morality. And it always amazes me that the Chinese built this great wall, and they thought the wall would protect them from invasion. But the folks north of the wall from Mongolia, they wanted to come in and raid. So they just bribed the guards, and the guards let them walk right through. So it wasn't really a defense, even though it looked impressive, if you can bribe the guards for money and they're not going to be loyal to your cause. And so, U.S. has by far the greatest military in the world. But, if we can't keep our own house in order, what good is that going to do us? And the focus needs to be on our own moral fiber and our own values and maintaining unity as a nation. Anyway, the tribe of Benjamin produced 4 great leaders, perhaps more, but at least 4 that are well known that come to mind. One of the judges that we've already talked about earlier on in our study, it says, was from the tribe of Benjamin. Do you remember who that was? Judges 3? Yeah, Ehud. Thank you. Good job. Ehud, who drove out the Moabites, I believe, was from Benjamin. And 2 Sauls are going to come from Benjamin, King Saul and Saul of Tarsus, who becomes the apostle. And remember, the thing they wanted about King Saul was they thought that he could lead them in battle. He was taller than was typical of the day, and they thought, oh, this is a guy that will, help drive out the Philistines and that kind of thing. And so he was a Benjamite. Who else was in history focused as being from Benjamin that is going to save the nation from what appeared to be certain destruction? Anybody know? Mordecai and Esther. Esther 2, 5-7. They talk about being from Benjamin. And Queen Esther was a Benjamite as well. So very thankful that these fellows, the 600 men that are left, found wives so that they could continue to, pass on these traits and eventually bring about the Apostle Paul. So I thought that was worth mentioning. Anybody else have any thoughts about the tribe of Benjamin? Okay. Israel was confronted with sin in its midst. What mistakes can you find and how they dealt with it? So they receive these body parts that are sent out to call the people to war, to deal with this immorality, which certainly got these people's attention. And everybody, one major city, the fellows from Jabesh Gilead, met the call to war. So normally they're fragmented, but in this case, there's enough moral outrage that everybody showed up at one city. And they're going to have to pay a pretty severe price for that. And we'll talk about that later on in our account. So what can you say? We don't really have time to read through all of this because our class ends early. So just from your reading of the text, what did they do wrong? It was good that they answered the call to deal with this terrible lewd and folly that has occurred in the land, as the text says. You think they're a little bit overeager to mete out punishment to the evildoers? Yeah, I think that's pretty clear, and they did not consult God as they should have before proceeding. They're going to consult God right before they finally, start the Civil War. But certainly they're going to be making some rash vows in this that's going to make things difficult later. They were overconfident in their position on the matter because even though they well outnumbered the Benjamites were no slacks and were well known for their prowess in battle. They were self-righteous and did not take into account their own lack of responsibility for not stepping in sooner, which is what we talked about last week. I think that's the most logical conclusion as to why they're doing God's will. God tells them to go up, but they fight against one another and they both have mass casualties. And I think the reason is that these people are pretty wicked themselves and certainly should have stood up sooner to this kind of thing that's going on in the land. And they did not seem all that eager to persuade the Benjamites that the Gibeonites had committed vile offenses. So it doesn't appear that there was much negotiation going on. It was just like, give us these men. And it could have been that a little bit of diplomacy might have avoided this. Don't know that for certain. But, they did not appear all that eager to contemplate how they should proceed. They just sort of rashly proceeded, as we often do sometimes when we get angry. No sorrow expressed that these events should have happened in Israel. And as we said, overconfident in their abilities. And so their judgment was skewed, resulting in senseless vows and overzealous killing of Benjamites. So what is the vow they made that got them in trouble? We're so mad at these Benjamites, we're going to what? Yeah, we're not ever intermarry with the Benjamite again. And of course, they were supposed to marry Israelites, not Canaanites. And so when the battle is so severe that the women and the children are killed, all but these 600 men, all of a sudden it's like, oops. And even they are smitten with, we didn't intend to completely wipe out one of our tribes. And so they were certainly overly zealous here. And one of the things I think is quite ironic is they almost did to their own people, one of their own tribes, that which they refused to do to the wicked Canaanites, which God wanted them to do. He wanted to just completely wipe these Canaanites out because of their wickedness. And that would have been a good thing because their influence would have been gone and they wouldn't have intermarried with them and they wouldn't have drawn their hearts away. So they're more zealous in their anger to deal with the tribe of Benjamin than they are with the Canaanites that they should have been this thorough with. I just think there's a lot of irony in all this. Okay, I don't want to just lecture tonight. Any thoughts about any of this? Any feedback? Okay. What was the strategy employed against Gibeah by Israel? Where have we seen this stratagem before? Someone want to summarize what the strategy was? First 2 times they lost pretty severely. The third time, they build an altar, they offer sacrifices, they finally turn to the Lord, and this time they come up with a pretty good plan. And what was the plan? What's that?
Kind of a sneak attack. They let them chase them thinking they were winning, and then all of a sudden, when they saw the smoke go up, everybody comes out.
Yeah, they had some people in ambush, about 10,000, I believe, that, once they're drawn out. And this caused them to leave the city defenseless. I mentioned earlier about that, they weren't just out in the field. They were having to fight the Benjamites, and they had the advantage of being behind a walled city. And so when they started running away, they got overconfident and ran out after them. And then people from ambush were able to run into the city, set it afire, and then when they see the city's afire, then they get just completely plummeted. So this should remind us of something we studied not too long ago. Where have we seen this before? Exact same strategy. Joshua and Ai, remember? That they went up first against Ai, and they were not successful because of Achan, the sin of Achan. Then after they dealt with the sin in the camp, then they decided this time, okay, we're going to have a real plan. And God gave them the plan. And they had a great victory in the very same way. And we studied that just a few months ago. All right, after Benjamin's army was defeated, what did Israel do to their possessions? Well, besides killing every man, woman, and child, except for the 600 men that escaped to the rock of Rimmon, the Israelites burned their cities, which would have almost certainly included their possessions. And from that day forward, the tribe of Benjamin is not just the youngest, but is the smallest of all the tribes. But that's not to say that they're not going to pass on their skills with slingshots and archery, and they're still going to be known for that throughout their history. And you get the impression in Philippians that Paul is pretty proud of being from this tribe, partially because they were so successful in battles. All right. What authority did Israel have to do this, if any? In view of Deuteronomy 7, 1 and 2, what ways can you think of that the tribe of Benjamin had become like the Canaanites? It's really interesting. Joshua is the people of Israel serving as God's holy army of hosts, goes in to wipe out the Canaanites. The Israelites take over Canaan, but once they get in the land, because they didn't finish the job, over time, what happens? The Canaanites absorb and influence the Israelites so that they become like the Canaanites, which is just really sad. And that's, of course, when you come out of the world and you become a Christian, you die to the old self and put on the new man. You can't compromise with the world, or before you know it, you become just like the world. And the thing that makes the church so unique and stand out and be a light in darkness is that we are not like the world. And yet the pressure is always to kind of be as much like them as possible, I think, because we want to fit in. And that's a dangerous compromise that we need to understand. It's not God's plan. So in Deuteronomy 7, they were told, when you go in, here are these 7 nations, and they're named, and they're told because they're so wicked, and they've been so wicked, and they've committed all these abominations, that God is bringing judgment against them, and you need to completely wipe them out. Anybody born into one of those nations that has been so corrupted is going to be corrupted by the culture. So the best thing you can do is just, in this case, bring judgment against that entire nation. Now, in Deuteronomy 13, 12 through 18, it provides instructions as to what to happen if when you get into the land, one of your cities apostatizes and commits idolatry. Deuteronomy 13, 12 through 18. If thou hear tell concerning one of thy cities, which Jehovah thy God giveth thee to dwell there, saying, certain base fellows are gone out from the midst of thee and have drawn away the inhabitants of their city. The idea is from God. Let us go and serve other gods, which ye have not known. Then shalt thou inquire and make search and ask diligently. And behold, if it be true and the thing is certain, so you don't just listen to rumors, you make sure you get the facts. And that abomination is wrought in the midst of thee, thou shalt surely smite the inhabitants of that city with the edge of the sword, destroying it utterly and all that is therein, and the cattle thereof with the edge of the sword. Thou shalt gather all the spoil of it into the midst of the street thereof, and shall burn with fire the city and all the spoil thereof. You don't keep it for yourself. Every whit you give it unto Jehovah thy God, and it shall be as a heap forever, and it shall not be built again. So, I think you can see where we're going here, that's what's happened here to the inhabitants of Gibeah. And then instead of going along with, let's root this evil out, the whole tribe says, no, we're going to defend this evil. We're going to defend the city of Gibeah. And so you might say that they then would be justified to do that to all the cities of Benjamin, which apparently that's exactly what they did. So it would be hard, your author says here, difficult to contend that a town of homosexuals would also be faithful followers of Jehovah and not idol worshipers. It gives a bit more difficult, though, when the action against the entire tribe of Benjamin is considered. But the argument could easily be made in falling in with the ranks of the Gibeonites that the rest of the tribe then was deserving of whatever punishment was meted out to them. So, given the sins committed against the Levite, which we looked at in detail last week, and their response when the rest of Israel came together to deal with this people of Gibeah, could be argued that they were essentially no different morally. So, any thoughts about that? Parallel in the church, of course, is if someone's committing sin and won't repent, you distance yourself from them. You try to get them to repent. And if they won't, you say, you can't be one of us anymore. Because a little sin leaveneth the whole lump. Yes, Lance.
There's just people today, I mean, nothing ever changes where they think God is such a loving God that no matter what type of sins or acts that you make, that God will love you. Well, yeah, he loves you, but he doesn't want the sin. And you show that he's a just God.
Yeah. If somebody is committing what's clearly immorality and clearly sinful things, the Bible says about the works of the flesh in Galatians 5, those who practice such. It's not that it's a one-time event. The idea is you continually practice this. You've given yourself over to it. Those people shall not inherit the kingdom of heaven. So if someone's engaged in the LGBTQ lifestyle, should we love them? Yeah, we love all sinners. God loves all sinners. Jesus died for us all while we're sinners. But love doesn't mean you just accept them in immoral acts. Because if you accept them and encourage them to continue in a behavior that's going to cause them to lose their soul, that's not love at all. So the loving thing to do is what Jesus did, is you, in love, point out the error or the sin, and you try to get them to do the right thing. Go and sin no more. And yet people have twisted this, if you said, Lance, and we act like you can't love somebody if you don't accept immoral choices that they make. And that is just the clear deception of the devil, that is for sure. Okay, anybody else? All right. What new oath do we learn of Israel making at Mizpah? Does making this oath pass the sanity test? Why or why not?
Give their wives or their
Yeah.
daughters
Yeah, not allowed to give any of their daughters in marriage to the Benjamites. Now, think this through for just a minute. It is probably a good example of how a man can sometimes get carried away by his emotions and say something extreme to demonstrate his zeal. Whatever the outcome of the conflict, it tied their hands for any future intermarriage. Even if one takes the position that the vow was made only after Benjamin refused to hand over the worthless men, what do the Israelites do after Benjamin has been taught a lesson? Assuming the tribe's not wiped out. That was never their intent. Their hands would still have been tied. When one assumes that wiping out the entire tribe was the intent from the beginning, the vow makes even less sense. So they obviously, this was rash and they weren't thinking this through. Yes?
Yeah, that wasn't their intent.
Well, because they all, when they realize there's only a few left, they kind of rent their garments and say, what have we done? So obviously they just acted in rage, overdid it, and then after they look at what they've done, they're sad that one of their own brothers is almost completely wiped out. That's why. Okay. Given that the only people remaining from the tribe of Benjamin are 600 men and the oaths were made, what are the long-term prospects for the Benjamites? Obviously, you need to procreate, right? The tribe was essentially wiped out. They weren't supposed to get wives from the Canaanites, and even if they wanted to, the implication is that the Canaanites were overrunning them, and they weren't in a position to marry the Canaanites. And the Israelites had vowed not to give them any wives, and the nation was not strong enough to conquer any of the surrounding nations, just to obtain wives for them. Hence, when the last of the 600 died, so would the entire tribe. What actions did the people carry out at Bethel? What was the response of the Lord? Why do you think this may have been the case? So what did they do at Bethel here? Well, they asked the question of the Lord, how could all this have happened? Which is what we just alluded to. And they build an altar at Bethel. By the word Bethel means the house of God. So this is where Abraham, hundreds of years before, had first built an altar once he got into the land. So they called it Bethel. So this is an appropriate place to build an altar unto God. Perhaps in the very same place where Abraham had offered the first offering to God in Israel. There was no response from the Lord. And so that kind of gave them concern. Kind of reminds me of what happened when they rebuilt the temple under Zerubbabel, and they waited for the Shekinah glory to come back like it did when it was first initiated by Solomon, and there's no Shekinah glory. And my judgment is that the Shekinah glory of God in the temple was actually Jesus, and that he's the glory. And he was the one that gave God's presence. And the book of Ezekiel says that God's going to let the glory of Jehovah leave the temple before the Gentiles come in and are allowed to destroy the temple. So it's not like they overwhelmed Jehovah. Jehovah and his presence left because of the people's sin. And if you do a word study on glory, the next time the Bible talks about, behold, the glory of Jehovah, it's Jesus coming in human form. And so the glory leaves the temple and then comes back in the body or the temple of Jesus Christ. And then later he says, I'm going to be killed, and on the third day, this temple is going to rise again, referring to the temple of his body. So why is it that God allowed them to rebuild the walls and rebuild the temple and in some ways rebuild the nation of Judah, but didn't respond when they anointed the temple the second time? I think it's pretty clear. Things are still not the same. I mean, they committed some awful atrocities. And so The nation will be restored, the Messiah will come, the promise will be fulfilled, but God is still not pleased with the Israelites. Very interesting to think about. So here, they're beseeching the Lord, and there's initially no response. It could have been that the Lord was not pleased with their building an altar. I don't think that's the case. I think he was pleased at other times where, they had built these things. But it's also possible that they seem to be blaming him for what happened when they come to him and they say, what's going on here? And they kind of have an accusative tone here in Judges 21, verse 15. And verse 14, and Benjamin returned at that time, and they gave them the women whom they had saved alive of the woman of Jabesh Gilead, and yet so they sufficed them not. And the people repented them for Benjamin, because that Jehovah had made a breach in the tribes of Israel. So again, they're sad of what they've done. It seems like Jehovah did this? Or was this the result of their own actions? Who did they ask about solving this problem, and from where did the answer come? Well, they asked themselves. And the answer came from themselves. And they reacted out of anger and vengeance. And things don't turn out well when that is the way we act and the way we treat these things. What was the two-step solution to this mess, that they've only got 600 men and no Benjamite women left, and they have sworn before Jehovah that they wouldn't let their daughters marry any Benjamites? They asked themselves, was there anybody who didn't meet the call to war? Anybody who didn't show up to help us fight this battle? Any cowards among us? And they go,
Does that mean they weren't part of the vow?
well, yes, it does. It means they weren't part of the vow. And it means that they were cowards, and if you don't come when you have a call to war, then you can go after them. And there's several other examples of that in the Bible. And so they decided to go after Jabesh Gilead and kill everybody but the virgin females. Boy, these were brutal times, weren't they? Wow, we think we got problems. But this only provided about 400 wives of the 600 that are needed. Second, they told the remaining Benjamites to essentially kidnap the wives they wanted from the unmarried women of Bethel. They had some ceremony, and they went out kind of dancing, and they said, it's okay, you can run out of the bushes and pick out a pretty one and grab them, and it's all supposed to be okay. And this way, we can't say that we gave our daughters to them. So it's a way of trying to give your daughters away and technically not giving them away. Not so sure how God felt about that, but that was the way that they were trying to fix the problem they created. Isn't this a bizarre story?
A bunch of lawyers with the second option.
Yes, it is. And so, how did the remaining Benjamites react? Well, I imagine they were pretty thrilled that they weren't wiped out like all the rest of their clan. While we're not told explicitly of their reaction, they were glad to have not been killed. They kind of run up the white flag, and they finally have peace when they realize they've got 600 people hiding out here. And they accepted Israel's offer of peace, consented to receive the 400 women of Jabesh Gilead, and did as they were instructed to obtain the remaining 200 wives. And at the conclusion of the episode, they went home to rebuild their towns and their farms, which had been completely devastated because of the war. All right. Can't make this stuff up, right? So, number one, true and false. The men of Shiloh were told not to complain about their daughters and sisters being taken. Well, I think the answer is supposed to be true. It's kind of like, listen, we're in a mess. We're trying to save the tribe of Benjamin, so this is how this is going to occur, and understand that this is for good. Pat brought up that they really don't actually tell them not to complain, but at least they explain why this is going on. So hopefully there will not be that much complaint. The town of Jabesh Gilead was selected by Lot to provide wife for the Benjamites. No, that's false. They were selected because they didn't show up to the battle, which is a no-no. The 600 Benjamites escaped to the rock of Ramon. That is true. And the men of Israel knew that the ambush was complete because of the smoke that came up from Gibeah. It's also true, just exactly like what happened at Ai. And in the third battle, the men of Benjamin lost about 30 men. Who lost about 30 men? The Israelites did. And the Benjamites got wiped out. So the point is, in this third attempt, the Benjamites lost any advantage they had, and only 30 casualties on the one side and tens of thousands on the other. So, what a gruesome end to the book of Judges. And then the last concluding verse. In those days, there was no king in Israel, and every man did that which was right in his own eyes. Which is another way of saying it was an age of moral relativism. And though they gave lip service at times to building altars to Jehovah and still recognized Jehovah was their God, people weren't taking this very seriously, were they? And so where is the end when man becomes the standard? You know, our president was on a show a couple nights ago, and he told the interviewer that when he was in high school that he saw these two nicely dressed men come up and that they kissed each other. And somebody asked him, what do you think about that? And he said, well, that's just two people who love each other. And he said that was an epiphany right then. Why should we tell other people who they should love? Well, first of all, I doubt 50 some odd years ago or 60 years ago, he's 80 years old, that kind of thing was going on. But, you know, a pedophile could say the same thing. I just love this little minor, this little kid. You know, who are we to tell people who to love? God is the one who sets these things up in motion, and he knows what's moral and what's not. And you have to direct your desires in a proper and godly way. And it's very disappointing to hear our president say the kind of things that he says to continue to justify things that are just anti-family and that cause us to be further and further driven away from God. So, painful chapter to read, but a reminder of what happens when we rationalize and substitute our judgment and our reasoning for God's. Yes, Gail.
Proverbs says, do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and shun evil. This will bring health to your body and healing to your bones.
Yep. Thank you, Gail. Bible also says, when wicked people rule on the throne, righteous people mourn. Some translations say righteous people moan. And that is so true. At any rate, I'd like for us to talk next week, just sort of in a broad brush way. I don't want us to leave this book without really understanding why we're being told this and what lessons can we learn. So our class time is about up, but I've got a lot of things that I've thought about that will help us, I think, make sense of this story and of this gruesome period of history so that we can end with some edifying lessons before we get into a very edifying book about Ruth, a beautiful story of love and of faithfulness in the midst of really difficult times. So that's the bell. Thank you so much for being here tonight. Appreciate you guys a lot, and look forward to next week. If you want to start reading over Ruth, do so, and also think about what lessons you can learn from this book, other than just the history. Thank you.
That's these favors, Ruth.